Hey guys, what's up? This is Mr. Miller here. We're going to be talking today about 16.2, and 16.2 is all about sample spaces. So we're going to start with a little bit of terminology. We're going to start with the word action. If we take a look here, action,
Rolling a number cube is an action with an uncertain result.
uncertain result. Okay, so things like flipping a coin would be an action, spinning a spinner would be an action, those types of things. Next up, outcome.
One possible result of rolling a standard number cube is rolling a 3.
So, in other words, what this means is what could happen, for example, if I flip a coin. An outcome could be tails. An outcome could be heads. If I was spinning a spinner with numbers 1 through 8, 7 could be an example of an outcome. Next up, sample spaces.
The sample space for rolling a standard number cube is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
So in this situation, what you can see is the sample space represents everything that could possibly happen. Again, we go back to a coin flip, and on a coin flip, heads, tails would be an example of our sample space. So in this situation, you see the band director choosing a trumpet player at random to lead the band. In the parade, you have to list all the outcomes in the sample space, choose one trumpet player basically to lead the band. So sample spaces would include James, Jenny, Raul, Seth, Sarah, Maria, Jenny, and Julie. And obviously the number of outcomes in the sample space would represent the number of those people that you just listed. So in this case, your answer would be what? 2, 4, 6, 8. So 8 would represent your number of outcomes in the sample space. Part 3, you can see we've got a spinner here, numbering 0 through 9. So you have 10 spaces. What is the sample space for the action? That would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. How many outcomes are there in the sample space? In other words, what numbers could you land on, or how many could you land on? Obviously, the number there would be 10. I'll give you the correct answer here as suggested, as indicated. Moving on to part 2. If we take a look at part 2 here, we're going to get into another term, event. An event represents a single outcome, or it could be a group of outcomes from the sample space. So you see here an example of this was if I roll dice as if I were playing Yahtzee, rolling a 3 would be an event that has one outcome. Rolling an even number would be an example of an event that has 3 outcomes, because you could roll a 2, a 4, or a 6 in order to represent the outcomes. The band director here is going to choose a trumpet player at random, and they're going to lead the band in the parade. Which trumpet players are in each event? We're going to click and drag to complete each situation. Event, choose a boy. So if we're choosing a boy, obviously we'd be looking at what? Seth. We would be talking about Raul. And we would be talking about James. Second event, if we choose a person who's wearing a striped shirt, obviously we're looking at Sarah Sarah. Raul still in play. And that looks like it's about it. Onward for next piece, slide 3, I'm sorry. In this situation, the action is one spin of the spinner. The event would be the spinner stops on an odd number. Which numbers are in the event? In other words, which numbers make this true? Obviously, we would think that any odd number would be in play. So 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 all should be examples of numbers that are in the events. And as you can see, that is in fact the correct answer. Slide 4. This is where it's going to be a little bit tougher, I think. You got to write a verbal description of the event. So the action is one spin of the spinner. The event is 3, 6, 9. So your verbal description could potentially be spinning a multiple of 3, for example, would probably be a good choice here. And as you can see, based upon the answer, that's exactly what they said. Numbers that are divisible by 3, which again is the same as multiples of 3. Moving on to part 3. If we move on to part 3, we see tiles completing the table. Now again, this will be a good one to kind of do interactively if you were doing it on your own anyways. And so you can see there, we want to know the location of the action, the sample space, and the event. So in this particular first situation, our numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That represents a number cube, so obviously it's going to go in the first column. And if it goes in the first column, that is a list of all the numbers that represent the sample space. If I roll a number less than 3, then that will be an example of something very specific. That would be an event, I believe. Blue, red, green would be an example of sample spaces on the spinner. Spinning the spinner is your action on the spinner. Rolling a number cube would represent your action on the number cube. And then the spinner stops on blue would be your final response. If we check baby that, you can see we're good to go. Questions there? If not, we move on. Guess I can't get any questions since you're not here. List the following in order: action, sample space, event. Again, the hardest part to kind of look at and decipher, an action is going to be very general. Think of Mrs. Rockwood and Mrs. Bourne's class. What are you actually doing that represents an action verb? And then your event is more specific. Your sample space is easy because you're just basically listing everything that's in play. So if we take a look at this, my choices would be the following. And so playing the game would represent your action. Your sample spaces, the only 3 things that could happen, a win, lose, or tie, should represent your sample space. And then the last thing there, winning the game, would be an event. So what? That would be represented by play the game, win, lose, or tie. Should be D. D it is. If there are no questions, let's move on to something we rarely do in class because we run out of time. Let's look at the key concept, or actually, we're going to look at key concept. We're also going to look at the close and check here in just a moment. That would kind of be like an exit ticket, exit quiz, if you will. If I take a look at this particular picture, it shows you buttons, and I think for most of us, it's going to be a little difficult to see exactly what's going on with the buttons, but the action is choosing a button. You can see the outcome there. You're going to write down each possible result, which in this case is each button represents an outcome. The sample spaces would be the set of all possible outcomes. All the buttons represent the sample space. And an event is a group of 1 or more possible outcomes. In this particular case, if they say choose a white button, 4 of those buttons would represent that particular event. Last but not least, let's take a look at a close and check. On the close and check, this is in essence, as I said, a ticket that would represent kind of an exit ticket. And do you understand what just took place? Do you understand the lesson that we just did? So, talked about the difference between an action and an event. We said action is basically verbiage, or very similar to an action verb in Mrs. Rockwell and Mrs. Bourne's class. Very general. An event would be a little more specific. If I talked about spinning a spinner, that would represent an action. If I said I spun an even number, that would represent an event. Take a look down here further. Use the picture for exercise 1. So you have a deck of cards there, or should I say about what, 7 cards there. We're going to choose 1 card. How many outcomes are in the sample space? Now, the difficulty here is you have to list all the outcomes. So you would have to list 7 different outcomes. You have striped card, and you actually would have to list that 3 times. You would have to list the checked cards. You'd have to list that 2 times. And you'd have to list the polka dot cards, which you would also have to write down 2 times. So there are, what, 7 outcomes there is what they would say. Number 2, choose 1 card, choose a striped card. In that situation, how many cards represent that event? 3 of those cards are in the events. Number the following, use 1 for action, 2 for sample space, and 3 for event. Again, as we said, we're going to, the first one that's pretty easy to identify here, in my opinion, is a list of all the possibilities that would represent a sample space. Choosing a direction would represent a very general situation, and then a more specific situation would represent our event. So 3 would represent picking the right, okay, for the event. Questions there? Moving on. Last but not least, we take a look at some of these things. Cafeteria sells sack lunches with either a ham sandwich, turkey wrap, peanut butter sandwich, or corn dog. Well, lunches are not labeled. Determine the action, determine the sample space, and the event for buying a sack lunch. So the action would simply be what? Picking a lunch. The sample space, you'd have to list every possible situation. So you have a ham sandwich, turkey wrap, peanut butter sandwich, or corn dog. So that means there should be 4 sample spaces. And in the situation for an event, you could pick, you could say, hey, let's have a sandwich that has meat in it, okay? And in that particular situation, you would obviously have 3 of them that would count for that in the ham sandwich, the turkey wrap, and the lovely corn dog that we serve often here at school. Okay, guys, that pretty much concludes. Oh, we've got error analysis, I'm sorry. In a certain game, players roll again. If they roll a 6 on the number cube, your friend says that rolling a 6 is an action. You saying it's event. Explain who is correct. On this particular situation, the action would simply be rolling the cube, again, very general, rolling the die, very general. And the event would be something more specific, specifically what would you want to roll? And in this case, rolling a 6 would represent the event. Questions, problems, issues, please make sure that you are willing to email me, call me on my phone, extension 3114, or possibly even look into MobyMax and or look into the assignment itself. There are opportunities to chat it up with me in regards to any questions you might have. Well, if there's no further questions, we're going to go ahead and move on and conclude 16.2. You guys have a great day and stay safe. Bye.